is this a wind-up gramophone?
I don't really know. But that just reminded me. Didn't you do a project which was something about maybe some mixed media installation with poetry? Yeah, didn't.
Oh yeah, in Abergavenny, that was with the Landmark Trust, and I was poet in residence for 2 years while this medieval whole house was being completely renovated because it was in such disrepair. So it was a real amazing experience to be there for 2 years. And I didn't want at the end to have just a collection of poetry on a page. I wanted it to represent the live experience of the house being, because it was a very noisy site, you know. But before the craftsmen had come, it was a very silent site. So I wanted to recreate the whole kind of journey of it coming back to itself. So in each of the rooms by the opening event, I had speakers. I had like a Makita, you know, workman's speaker, and made sound poems so that when people came, they could immerse in the experience rather than read. And yeah, it filled the house. It was lovely. And I feel like that's the way to go, really. Is I love reading books. I'll always love reading books. But I think thinking of ways of our poetry, you know, I've worked with jazz quintets and done various installations, and I want to work more along those lines, kind of being a bit more inventive. You've reminded me actually in asking me the question, is I've just had a book published, but I want to get more inventive about how I give and receive poetry. Yes, yeah. I'm reading from my new collection, Healing the Pack. It came out in May this year, 2024, with Verve Poetry Press. This is Healing the Pack. She's leaning, little one, against the beach, spine to trunk where no one can reach her, hear her pleading, tree, swallow me. In the fields where there will be houses, her spaniel machine guns the grasses, snouting something in the under, while she's picking her thumbwort, aware of her own scenting, sweat on the down of her sealed lip, willing and ignoring of itch from polycardy, her scab from the street party, crest splitting every time she's on bended knee. I know I'll find her there against that tree, eyes attached to the parting grasses. I tell her with the only voice she will hear, sit. I turn her back to the wilds, so she faces the hill below with the housing estate and that terrible house. I sit her on tree root. Remember the cheap daps and Lady Die-Cut. I draw her in, let her latch on, be leech to me. I make it hurt a little, the acknowledgement of arms, and then I am wolf pelt. I wrap hot hood, animal stink fresh from kill round her until she slips on the whole hide from ear to claw. Run, I say, run, hunt down the poet you'll become, bite out her tongue, teach her what it is to howl.
Bore da, Clare. How lovely to be here in the Wetlands Reserve and listen to you read, and I'm honoured to be able to ask you a few questions about your poetry.
Diolch, Taz.
Your most recent poetry collection, Healing the Pack, published by Verve Poetry Press, has been warmly received by readers and critics, and I can see why, because it's a fantastic collection.
Thank you.
There had been a few years between your previous book and the most recent, and I wanted to know about your poetry journey leading to this latest book.
Yeah, thanks, Taz. Yeah, it's been about 18 years between the two collections. My first one, Spilling Histories. I haven't been fallow in that time. I've been facilitating workshops, teaching. I've made some radio programs. I directed a documentary. I've translated for the National Poet of Wales. So I've been very busy and raising 2 children. But I think, you know, I'm still processing this, why it took me so long to have a collection, although I was having publications quite regularly. And I think because of what the book is about, dealing with some difficult subjects, adverse childhood experiences, mental health issues, I felt like I had to get it right. And also, I felt still a bit afraid and still a bit of a lingering of shame. So it took me a long time to work through that. And actually it was the writing of the poetry that helped me write the poetry, the process. And I had a bursary from Literature Wales many years ago to write this collection, which was called at the time A Certain Darkness. And really those poems were mawkish. And I'm so glad it's taken me a long time, because I'm glad that I wrote those poems because I needed to. But now I think it enabled me to have some distance and to write in a new way.
I was, the first time I heard you, I was quite struck by not just your kind of delivery as a performance poet, but actually the poem which I always think of is a poem about your grandmother. And so this is going back, I think, pre-pandemic. You read with Jonathan Edwards at the Cardiff Central Library, and you know there is always a special bond between you and the reader, as you are just a fantastic reader. And I wonder, when you were writing about your grandmother at an earlier stage, are you writing about your grandmother in a different way now?
That's a great question. My grandmother is the person who kind of would give me butcher paper and a pencil from the betting shop and say, write. And I think, you know, maybe it was to keep me busy while she was doing chores. But so her house and her heart and her hearth were kind of like my cauldron for writing. So initially when I was writing about my grandmother, it was literally about missing her and the things we did together. But now she's become sort of a force and a poet behind my back in a way. I think Gwyneth Lewis mentioned something about that in her book recently, that a poet always has another poet behind them. And you know, on her deathbed, my grandmother wrote she spoke her very first poem. So she's become something of a powerhouse for me. And when I do a poetry reading, I always begin with this poem about my grandmother, because it stabilizes me. And it reminds me of, she was, you know, quite a forceful woman. Physically, she had to do a lot of labor. And to me, I equate that with the labor I do with my poetry. And I need to summon that up. And it's through my nan that I'm able to do that. Taking it out. When my grandmother chopped wood, when my grandmother chopped wood split clean, the axe gleamed. When my grandmother chopped, not just for wood, but for the sound, for the chopping sound, I was safe. When my grandmother chopped, when my grandmother swung, heaved, halved, when my grandmother chopped wood, neighbours went indoors. When my grandmother chopped wood, even the axe understood.
How did poetry begin for you, and do you remember your earliest poems?
Oh yes. I lived in a house with my mum and dad and my grandmother and my uncle, who were both coal miners. And so I was raised in a house with Northern Soul, Led Zeppelin and Max Boyce, and lots of songs and poetry. My first book I ever had of poetry was when I was about 4. And my uncle gave it to me, and it was written by local children, and it was from one of the miners' libraries. So my first kind of ownership of a book that had poetry in it was of other children, although it was like decades before. And I started to say poetry before I could write it. And then I remember in school, we came across the poem Another Case of Murder by Vernon Scannell, and that was a seismic shift for me. When I felt, although I couldn't articulate it, that a poem can do something that's so powerful that it can speak about somebody else's feelings. And then I wrote a poem for my mum for Mother's Day. I think I was about 4. And when I was in school, in comp, at age 11, I wrote a poem about an oak tree. And then I never wrote again for a decade. And I recently found that poem, and it made me cry, because I understood that the child was trying to say something with the metaphor. And I understood my poem for the first time, and I understood that child. And I think on some level, when I was 11 and I wrote that, I felt that, and that's why I stopped. And I was doing academics then, and It wasn't until I moved to Mississippi and I was 23 that I wrote a poem again. And then I started to kind of reconnect with poetry. And, you know, I left America after 10 years because I read The Journey by Mary Oliver. It changed me. So again, I had Vernon Scannell that changed me, and then I had, you know, Mary Oliver's The Journey, and that brought me home. So for me, The Journey was joy and enchantment as a child, and then it held some feelings that needed to be held. And I carried it all for a long time, and then I started to write some really bad poetry. And then, you know, started to see that poetry, I could tap into that force too, and I could do what I wanted with it. And it was playful and safe and awesome.
I wanted to kind of connect the childhood to something which I know is very important to you, which is motherhood. I know that you actually encourage your children to write poetry, and I just wonder if you see yourself and your children, you know, going through the same journey, or, you know, maybe you see the same sort of encouragement that your mother and your grandmother, kind of the influence that they had as this kind of, you know, the instigator of the poetry culture in Wales. I wonder if you see yourself playing that role with your children as you encourage them, because I'm quite sure, didn't one of your sons win a competition? Maybe it's a couple of years ago, one of the Dylan Tays.
And my daughter, yeah. And then, interesting, my father, who was a retired firefighter and a retired toolmaker, he would send me texts saying, oh, write this down in one of your poems. And in the end, I said, Dad, you've got to start writing your own, which he does. And he's a phenomenal poet himself. And we've been on Radio 4 together. So my children my daughter in particular is a far better poet than me. She's 14, and she's in the kind of like the purity of it, and she's not worried about what other people are thinking. And like, you know, when you start to do it to put your work out there, it's a different thing. So in my house, their piano playing, my son's a fantastic poet too, that we're feeding off one another, and we're always aware of giving each other something that's inspiring, and we receive one another's work and are made better by it. And so I feel like I'm not the mother of their poetry in any way. They are doing that all of their own accord, and it's very distinct and different to me. And I just feel, I feel so privileged to be in receipt of the things they write. It's just wonderful. Rewilding. Mama, solid as a boulder. We are bound together, the same rock grown of rock. A crow can rest on us, preen its feathers, dash a nut on our shoulders. It's like this we see across the valley. The wind blows over the hills, and Mama hums the old sounds. They send us to the out-of-sleep place where we wander with feet, where we tumble on the plateau, where we fly, crow.
You've already mentioned your time spent in America, and I think you spent some time in the American South, if I remember reading correctly. I'd love to know how your time in the US has impacted your writing, but also, you know, you are one of Wales's fantastic facilitators. You know, you run a lot of poetry workshops. I wonder how you've been impacted as a writer and as a workshop leader, having had this experience of, you know, travelling to a huge country with a different tradition.
Yeah, and in fact I spent 3 years in Mississippi and 7 in New Orleans in Louisiana, and even the difference between living in those two states was huge. But I think what I loved about being in the Deep South, it was just sing-songy. I come from the Welsh valleys, and we are quite, you know, it feels like there's a melodic way of a turn of phrase, and I felt that, I connected to that in New Orleans and in Mississippi. And everything there is intense, there's jazz, it's just freeing. It's such a complicated place as well, you know. There's a lot of things that are not so good about the Deep South, and but it's such a melting pot of different cultures and musics and foods, and you can't help but be inspired by that place and the people. It's absolutely beautiful. And when I was in university in Mississippi, I did literature. All my friends did creative writing, and so I wasn't taking classes in creative writing, but I did a poetry reading one night, and it was the first time I'd ever read a poem outside of my bedroom. And Angela Ball, the poet Angela Ball, said I could come and do some classes with her, and that's the first time I had kind of instruction in how to write poetry. And so I got to learn about how you hold a workshop and in a creative way. I think as well, you know, the whole fact that I lived there and I left, I think it was a year before the Levy disaster, Hurricane Katrina, happened, and so that created a lot of intense emotion, and I went back not a few months after, and I didn't have the words to speak for what it was like going back. So I worked with a jazz quintet with Gareth Roberts, and that kind of fusion of poetry in Wales with a Welsh musician in a jazz context allowed me to kind of shape back some of what I'd experienced when I'd lived there. So it was a hugely healing and cathartic process. And I think the poetry community, there are lots of poetry communities in New Orleans, but I felt really held. And also the school I taught in, I was an English teacher in Metairie Park Country Day School. And in the English department, it was expected that we would be nurtured as writers, and we were sent on retreats. And we, you know, our Betsy Peterson, the head of our department, you know, we'd start a meeting with writing. We'd all write, and then we'd have a meeting. So it was like writing, poetry. We weren't just there as teachers to teach. We were in the process of writing, creating, feeding off one another and learning from our students. It was absolutely magical. And that, to me, is what I've brought back. So that when I'm facilitating a workshop, I'm not even sure I like that word, and when I'm holding a space, and I'm in the space as well, because there's this lovely thing that happens, this process, it's fire, it's alchemy, it's magical. What privilege to be able to do that.
I want to be as sensitive as possible in sort of asking a follow-up question, and that is, you know, you talked about the levees breaking, you know, which is a very specific recent tragedy that actually has implications in the cultural life of people, because not only did people experience a tragedy, but it has been represented in poetry and art. And in Wales, you know, if you've spent any time in Wales, you know about Aberfan, you know, just like in a Grenfell for the Caribbean and African community in England. And because your poetry is very much about the mind and response to how we feel, I wonder if you had anything to say about that experience of that sort of, you know, writing about an experience which is so traumatic.
Yeah, and also who am I to speak of it? I don't live there anymore. Granted, I still had, you know, my stuff was still in storage, but that's just stuff. It wasn't my home anymore. And so I didn't have an immediate loss in any way, other than it's a place I lived in for a decade, and I loved it, and I lived there. And to go back and see houses, you know, the street I lived on, you know, there's houses gone, and it was awful. But you're right to ask this question, because it is about the responsibility and, you know, what do we do when we're writing about other people's suffering, other people's issues. I don't have an easy answer for this, other than I was aware of that, and it's what kept me quiet sometimes, because I was like, I don't know what I'm allowed to say. Am I allowed to have these feelings when I'm back in Wales in a dry house, and, you know, other people are displaced? But don't forget, I had friends still there, my best friends, and some family from my previous relationship. So they, you know, we were in contact, and so it was difficult. It was very difficult. But I'm very fond of Nigel Jenkins' work, and in one of his poems, Advice to a Young Poet, he says something like, you know, be cautious after the latest tanker disaster not to wade into the oil slick. So it's a question you've asked me, and there's no answer other than, for me, it's about, and I don't always get this right, and I haven't always got it right, but it's about always considering what's the implications of that, of what I want to write about. And yeah.
Mindfulness and the need to heal from the experiences of modern life are themes sometimes associated with your poetry. Please tell me more about these aspects of your poetry.
Yeah. Mindfulness, I suppose, is as much about being embodied, being in the body, being in the environment, and a poem allows you to do that, I feel. And I think you ask about modern society having to heal from those things. I mean, at this current time, there's just terrible things going on in the world and with our planet. And so I think poetry is a way for us to voice, to process, to be activists, to witness, and it's a force of energy. And you know, when many people are feeling hopeless, I feel like if we can, it can still us. A poem can still us. It can remind us how we connect to one another. So I think that's really important. And I think with the pace of life, everything, I think so many of us are kind of like toxically overworked and sped up, that when we're in a poem, it teaches us to slow down. We have to breathe properly. We have to enter this space, and it's a sacred space. And I think many of us are losing our religion, to quote Aria. And I think poetry restores a little of that. I mean, the epigraph at the beginning of my book is from Faithless. You know, this is my church. This is where I heal my hurts. And this is why I devote my work in life to facilitating workshops for people who come to poetry for some solace, for some support, for some anger, for some voice, to reacquaint themselves with themselves. And they come with their own energies, their own gifts, and then they enter this thing we do, and they, you know, it does something. And I feel so good doing that. It feels tangible. It doesn't feel woolly. It feels like people are able to do this. And it makes subtle shifts. And then you think about somebody like Maria Rivera. I was introduced to her work through Richard Gwynn's The Other Tiger. You know, she's in Mexico. And her poem, Los Muertos, you should go look it on YouTube, when she's writing about the massacre of migrants. You know, this is a woman, a poet, who's writing a poem that risks her life. So that's a huge thing to me. You know, I'm worrying about a line break here or there or whatever, and she's writing something that stands for something really important. And so there are those of us who would kind of do, if you think about mindfulness, for me, I suppose it's an eco-spirituality, the kind of poetry I'm interested in or that I write. But somebody like Maria Rivera is making us mindful of what's going on in the world. We've got in Wales Abir Amir doing this, you know, doing the same thing, and Patrick Jones, Mena Elfyn, you know, poets who are making us mindful, waking us up from our slumber.
I wonder if I may ask something which doesn't feel directly related, but maybe it is. It is that I know you write in Cymraeg as well. I'm not a Welsh speaker. I wonder if, you know, when you write in English and in Welsh, I wonder if that healing aspects are differently approached.
Oh, that's such a brilliant question, Taz. And I'm working on that actually at the moment, because yes, I feel a difference. And people who've heard me read my poetry in Welsh say there's a difference. I can't articulate what it is. Maybe it's this, maybe in English, because I'm raised in English, my narrative, my tics, my way of, my defense mechanisms, the story I create that, you know, in my head, is familiar. In Welsh and Cymraeg, you know, dwi gorfod meddwl a ffordd wahanol. I have to think in a different way because I have a limited vocabulary. I have to learn new words, and I don't have a kind of a attachment to some of them. And then there's the emotion around the fact that I wasn't raised speaking Cymraeg, and I should have been. So it's quite loaded. So I have lots of healing work to do in Cymraeg. But I think having written in Cymraeg, it's been about the last 2 years, I think it's strengthened me as a poet and as a poet who can write in English as well. I'm still, this is a great question, and I'm still, this is where I'm going next, is to kind of consider what that is, what's going on with that beautiful, what is that rhythm and that melody, yr alaw yna, beth mae hwn yn dysgu fi, what is that doing to my soul and my blood and my ancestral memory. Swy'n gan, summoning. Pull y rach, the witch's cauldron, soup of iaith, words held and spoken. Rhythm pulled by moon and tongue, hear its pitch from swell and belch, rack and kelp of vowels sung. Look now to this murmuring trickster, pre-linguistic meaning maker, pull and push, push through bulch, pull and push, push. Here the baptized words are brining, consonants reverberating. The tides a swirl of incantation, sacred knowing being written. Under chin of rock, the sea's graffiti, yr iaith gaeth ar y traeth, on shale of shore, the healing lip.
You were influenced by the poet Chris Torrance, who had so generously taught evening creative writing classes at Cardiff University, inspiring generations of aspiring writers. How did Chris influence your own poetic voice and development?
Yes, that was an absolute privilege to have met him. I think more than poetic voice, I think what I learned from Chris was how to live the poem, how to live the poetry, and how a state of being, I mean, I can only ever aspire to touch the edges of that. But it's about an alertness and a connectivity and a real generosity of spirit. And in his letters and visiting him, he would just, I felt like he wouldn't overtly say, you need to do this or listen to this, or he would put things in my path, like a cutout from a magazine, for instance, that might spark. He knew that that might spark something, or a postcard with an image that would play over. And so he was aware of that the poet needs feeding with things to think about. And books, he subscribed me to Beat Scene magazine and, you know, gave me books on proprioception, and I learned about the feminine, the divine feminine, and Egyptian myth and Celtic myth. And he also gave me a trowel. And I think what he was showing me there was you have to dig deep and you have to plant and nurture and grow and harvest and start again, because poetry is work. And so for me, that's the biggest gift of all, is not to be in the ego space, to be in the digging and to be at the work and going back to the work and the energy of that. The title of this are ellipses, so ellipses. That's how my father tells it, as he stands in the road where she'd lived, his mother, she in the picture from the Old Town book, only 17, at the Jubilee Street party, leaning to the left a little, pretty as a rosebud all about bloom, not yet thinned out. Promise of cake and pie and a stout maybe, promise of clearing plates back in a house stuffed with love. Happy the Queen, or was it the King, had come to the throne, united before the war, before all those wars that squatted on another street.
Who are the poets from today and yesterday you like to read?
Oh, I love to read whoever I'm reading, and charity shops. I pick up a book or go to a reading. Can I scrap that? That was just a rubbish answer. There are many, and they change. I'm not a poet who likes to kind of get every book by a particular poet. I have a quite eclectic taste. I think in this country, Jonathan Edwards, Menna Elfyn. I love how Menna Elfyn's work in translation kind of adds something to my understanding of writing in Cymraeg and in English. And I'm really looking forward to Christina Thatcher's new book. Outside of Wales, I've just recently discovered the poetry of Hone Tufare, who was the Timata Poet Laureate in New Zealand. And his work is so beautiful. It's so deeply connected to his land. And which reminds me of Gary Snyder. I like Gary Snyder's work a lot. He was called the Poet Laureate of Deep Ecology. And I love Mary Oliver. I really like green poets, not just poets who are kind of activists. I don't mean that, but poets who actively engage with nature, of which we are, and share it with those of us. They take us deeper into the woods, so to speak. Joy Harjo, William Stafford. Really, as a child in Blackwood Comprehensive, my teacher, Mr. Clifford James, he introduced us to Daniel the Jazz by Vachel Lindsay. And so it was American poets for me from the get-go. And then when I studied in Swansea University and Mississippi, it was the Black Mountain poets, the Beats, Southern Central American poets. So I really I'm interested in American poetry, so diverse and rich. But currently reading Victoria Chang's book, which is just astonishing. Last night, my dream had subtitles. I've been binging on Scandi dramas, Welsh language noir series, and because our daughter has started light sleeping, waking at the settling of floorboards or next door's cat flap, we sit in whispers. We have subtitles on. Last night, instead of dreaming my dream, I was reading the text and the subtext.
We've talked about you being a bilingual poet in the sense of writing it, and I know that you've done a fair bit of translation work as well. I'm curious to know, what are you working on at present, or perhaps interesting projects you've been involved in with regards to this bilingualism, translation, etc. And if there's anything lined up in the future that you want to talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting that I learned Welsh in school. It was an English comp in Blackwood, and I did an A-level in Welsh, so it was many years ago, but I retained my Welsh. And I think what helped me be able to write in Cymraeg, in Welsh, was translating first. And I'm forever indebted to Ifor ap Glyn for, when he was National Poet of Wales, I translated some of his work. And I felt like that was an apprenticeship with the language, really. And it was generous of him to kind of help me, I suppose, in a way, it helped me understand Welsh from a different way. Not trying to learn it and get in, but get inside it and try and get out, which was quite fascinating. And I've translated for other brilliant poets, like Grieg Mews and Dominic Williams. And I've had my work translated by people like Menna Elfyn, which again, when you have your work translated, it enables you to access your work in a different way. It's just a very live and vibrant thing. And I've always liked Richard Gwynne's work in translation and discussions around that in fiction fiestas and things like that. So yeah, translation's interesting. And so I'm glad I've broken the back of 18 years between books, because as soon as Healing the Pack was out in May, my third book is at my editor Esyllt at the moment with Cyhoeddiadau'r Stamp, Nôl Iaith. And it's in Welsh and Cymraeg, and it's a pamphlet, so it's a slimmer volume. But it's about retrieving the language. So I don't see myself as second language. speaker, but as somebody who's gone to fetch it, to bring it back. So it's been a very interesting journey. And I'm making another BBC Radio Wales poetry radio programme, kind of a little bit about the poetry culture of Wales in terms of what does it mean, Welsh poetry? What is that thing? And what does it mean if you've come from somewhere else as a poet? So that's interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, I often hear this term Wales as a nation of sanctuary, and there are so many kind of, I guess, visiting poets in Wales or poets who have come to find Wales a home. And I wonder, in relation to what you said, with your own travels as well, I wonder if there's anything that, do you have any aspirations for doing something, maybe in another country, maybe, connecting Wales to something else in terms of this, taking up this poetry culture?
Oh yes, and I'm starting to shift my understanding of bilingualism and yr iaith Gymraeg, the Welsh language. So I recently facilitated a Writing for Wellbeing course with Iola Yner, and Iola Yner is first language Welsh. And what we decided was we weren't going to, we had first language Welsh participants and some people who didn't speak Cymraeg, and we had English people come on the course. And we decided that we weren't going to say something in Welsh and then say it in English, because that kind of, I don't know, it diluted that experience for the first language Welsh people. And also it just felt trite to do that. So sometimes, we all agreed up front that sometimes things will happen in Cymraeg, in Welsh, and that bit might be lost, but something else will be picked up. So it was just this natural honouring of this, our language, yr iaith Gymraeg. And erbyn y diwedd, by the end of the course, people were using Welsh. And one participant who was from England, was talking about, wow, this language, and people using it. And it was just a big shift for me. And many years ago, I was part of the contingent from Wales there was about 100 of us, artists, makers, craftspeople, went to the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And, I noticed then that the people like Eva Apgelin and Kerry Wynn and Aneirin Cradog were reading their poems in Welsh, and American people were coming and listening and really, intrigued and respectful of it. And I thought, if in Wales we had an evening of Welsh language poetry, only Welsh speakers would come. So it can be possible for us to do this. It's just shifting our relationship with it. And I think it has a lot to do with how a lot of people who don't speak Welsh feel outside, and so I would like to do some work with this and champion yr iaith Gymraeg, achos mae'n mor bwysig, mae'n mor bwerus, mae'n mor bert.
Diolch yn fawr, Claire. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and finding out about your poetry journey and inspirations.
Thank you, Taz, and thanks for your generosity. It's brilliant.